It was the dawn of the 22nd century, and the continued collapse of civilization and environmental chaos threatened the extinction of the human race. As the situation grew more grim, nations desperately tried to cope with the situation, but the politics and alliances of the previous century continued to foil any efforts to solve the world's problems. Corporations manipulated scarcities for their own profit and did not want them solved, often taking their orders from plutocrats above in their orbital havens. Old systems of thought remained fixated on their antique struggles against evil instead of finding the solution. Rationing systems were foiled by an unwillingness for the First World to give up on-demand consumerism. Food and water distribution schemes could not move forward as activists rejected any idea of merit determining who should be fed. Attempts to solve the swelling refugee problem were sabotaged equally by reactionary nationalists and human rights advocates. Religious demigods stood in the way of population control, peace movements hampered military solutions, collusion between corporate entities and nationalist governments broke every step toward global pollution controls. Environmentalists refused to allow the desperate climate control techniques that were proposed. Solutions could not be found amongst the entrenched interests and ideologies that had birthed the very crisis mankind faced. The same old battle lines were drawn again and again. The lords of opinion and outrage seemed content to be the pallbearers of civilization. The situation demanded a great change, and that change came in the usual way, through fire and blood. That great change was called unity. It was a philosophy, a movement, a prayer in the darkness, an idea that burned through the world. It swept through nations and governments like a cleansing fire. It conquered elections, dissolved democracies. It overthrew oligarchs and authoritarians that stood in its way and displayed their corpses on the palace steps. Unity envisioned a world where humanity seized responsibility for its own survival, a global society sharpened like a spear to face the crisis which enveloped it. Everything would be judged by how well it served this purpose. Cognitive analysis and mathematical modeling would replace emotional pleas and rusted ideals. Appeals to emotion and sympathy, ideas of democracy and freedom, these were tempting, but unity declared them utopian, unrealistic, and ultimately responsible for the collapsing Earth. The worldwide nightmare had to be stopped, for the specter of death was too close, and in the name of humanity's survival, any action was acceptable, no matter how cruel, for it was more cruel to let billions suffer and die, and for that crime, the old world had to be swept away. Unity declared that to rebuild Earth, we must clear away the mistakes of the past, unite all of humanity, and make sure the worthy survive. And it declared that those societies which had consumed and bred out of control, the institutions which had stood in the way of action, and the philosophies that had made simpering pleas for compassion in the face of our extinction, those that had brought the long night had no right to demand a place in the sun. Unity called for the willful destruction of the outdated binary divisions that had ruled us too long. The Marxists and the capitalists, the manipulative trade organizations, and the idealistic pseudo-revolutionaries who opposed them. The insanity of religious extremism, the weeping concerns of animal rights and environmentalism, the cheap empathy of humanists that could not bear the idea of what had to be done. All these movements would share the same mass grave. There was no more time for subjectivity or pleasant lies. There was only the cruel math of calories and population. Humanity's continuation as a species was the only concern. Those who would save humanity would be rewarded. Those who were responsible for driving mankind to the edge of oblivion were not worthy of the consideration the centuries of mewling over human rights had demanded. The cancers that racked the world had to be burned out. Whatever the consequences, whatever the cost, humanity would not perish because of some pathetic crisis of conscience. And so began decades of bloodshed. At first, the Unity movement concerned itself with the control, culling, and dispersing of refugee camps that strangled many of its member nations, as well as the destruction and dissolution of the remnants of capitalism, democracy, and other vestiges that stood in the way of Unity's reforms. Refugees were classified by how well they would serve Unity's great task. Some were harshly expelled, and those who resisted were unrepentantly massacred. Medical care, food, and water were subjected to massive rationing programs based on the usefulness of each citizen to the cause of human survival. Harsh methods were employed to control the movement of disease and blights. Democracies were replaced with vicious meritocracies with the power of life and death. This process was not called revolution. This process was called integration. And then Unity stretched out his hand and conquered the broken earth. There were casualties, many casualties. If the masses would not be controlled, they would be decimated with weapons thought unusable a century before. As warlords fought alone against the forces of United Earth, millions suffered and died, and entire cities were turned into graveyards. This process was not called conquest, it was called unification. By the second half of the 22nd century, the Earth was ruled by the United Earth Authority, a monolithic alliance based on the philosophy of the three principles. Unity, that all humanity would be under one banner so that division would not dilute our purpose. Primacy, that those who serve the greater good of human survival would be preserved above others. And continuity, that humanity would not face extinction whatever the cost. Under the authority, the world was divided into two types of regions: the conquered and suppressed administered zones, brutally exploited and whose populations were deemed secondary, and the primary zones, hyper-urban areas that were members of the United Earth Council, the last vestige of the nations which originally united under the Unity movement. The authority made no apologies for the survival of the primary zones being its first priority. Using the new technologies of cognition modeling, artificial intelligence, and applied memetics, combined with a massive surveillance state, every citizen of United Earth was judged. The Unity movement had no time for racism or nationalism. It rejected those ideas as the foolishness of the past. It instead focused on memetic fitness, whether or not a person's mind, beliefs, and personality were most suited to serve humanity's preservation. They combined this with a rejection of individual rights of expression and ownership, viewed as an obstacle to the world's problems that would no longer be tolerated, as well as consigning the principles of democracy, multiculturalism, ethical environmentalism, and postmodernism to the trash bin of history. For its massacres and its faults, United Earth managed to restore some life to the dying world. Resources were restored, pollution and waste brutally managed, and scientific institutions were revitalized. The last vestiges of global capitalism were swept away, as industry operated not with regulation, but only with the explicit permission of the United Earth Authority. For a decade, fuel and electricity were more luxury than they ever had been. But things slowly got better. The desert became farmland, the punishing summers became cooler, and fresh water began to flow. Genetically engineered plants and bacteria ravaged local ecosystems, but they did clean the water, purify the air, and rebuild the earth. We rose from the ashes, dug out by the harsh hand of the authority.